Hey everybody, welcome back to our journey to homesteading. Today we're going to talk about brewing beer. You can brew your own beer and it's not as hard of a process as you think. I started doing this about 10 years ago and I've made all kinds of beers. Everything from mock, Corona, Coors Lights, Dos Equis, stuff like that, all the way up to Russian stouts. It's not as hard as you think, it's pretty simple. I'm going to walk you through an overview of it and how to do it and kind of explain things as we go. You'll have to excuse the train if you hear that in the background. We got a lot of trains come by. So doing this on my patio, there's some equipment you'll need to do this. I have two 10-gallon coolers. You can see one here. One of them is to hold my water that I'm going to use to put in the grains that I bought. The other one will hold hot water after those grains have steeped for an hour, and then I'm going to rinse them and get all the rest of the starches out of those grains. You can do this two ways. You can buy grains at a local brewery store, or maybe even your local brewery. If you have a craft beer brewery and you want to buy some grains from them, they may sell you some. I don't know for sure on that. I've never done that. We don't have a lot of local breweries around here. Got into this as a hobby about 10 years ago, and since then I've done, I don't know, over 50 different types of beers, batches of beers, different things like that. I personally like a dark beer, stout beers, but let's go back to the equipment real quick. I do have two of these coolers. Here's my other one right here. And if you notice, they have a quarter turn ball valve in them with this spigot on here. I believe that is a 3/8 inch nipple on there. That way I can attach rubber hoses to it, and I'll show you those. Reason I attach these hoses are just so that I can get closer to the buckets. That is a food grade silicone hose. Make sure you use food grade on all this stuff. So those hoses just help me to where I can transfer my liquids easier. So I'll start with my hot water in one cooler, and I will put some into my other cooler just to get it warmed up, but the other cooler has a false bottom in it. If you get on any type of craft brew websites, you can Google those. You'll find the false bottoms. These are pretty easy to set up. Set both of these up in about 15 minutes. So not a hard, difficult process. I also have the 10-gallon brew kettle right here that I'm using. That's right now I'm heating up water, trying to get that water to 160 degrees. I got about 5.5 gallons of water in there right now. Once I get that temperature, I'm going to store it in my cooler where I'm going to keep my hot liquids. And so once I do that, I'll stick that up there and I'll begin to dump my grains in here. My mash tun is what that's called. I'm gonna dump them in there, and as I put those grains in there, I'm going to be draining warm water or hot water in there, and we're going to stir that. You don't want any dough balls in your grain. That way all the grains get water to them and all your starches get broke down and you have a higher efficiency rate. There's two ways to do this. I do the all grain method. I started out with just doing brew kits. You can do those. Basically, they've already taken all the grains, they've pulled all the starches, colors, flavors out of those, and they've boiled it down to a condensed like syrup. And you can heat that up, dump it straight into your brew kettle, add your water, your hops, and boil it that way. That's how I started. I decided to go to the all grain method. It's only one other step. You add your grains and your hot liquid into here and you let it steep for an hour. Then you drain that off and you do what they call sparging. You're going to rinse those grains with water and pull the rest of those starches out just to give you more volume plus a better overall efficiency rate to obtain your ABVs. So this isn't a hard process. We'll walk you through it. I don't want to bore you with heating up waters and all that type of stuff. That's a long process, but before you ever start this, you have to make sure all of your equipment is clean and sterile. So let me get this water heated up. I'll be right back. Okay, so our water's reached temperature. I brought 5.5 gallons of water up to 160 degrees. I want my strike water that's going to be in this initial cooler, which I've already transferred over, to be about 157 degrees, as close to 157 as you can. And one thing to remember is temperature is key in brewing beer. You don't want to break your starches down to the point where the yeast can't consume those and produce alcohol. Also, buy yourself a very good thermometer, digital instant read thermometer. You can find these on Amazon. You can probably get them at your local brewery stores. Find you something like that. That way you know exactly what your temperature is. Some of these require calibration. Had to calibrate mine this morning. It was about 8 degrees off. Haven't used it in about 6 months. So always boil water, stick that thermometer in there. Make sure you're reading 212 on that thermometer when the water's boiling. And at this point now, I'm gonna dump my grains in my mash tun, and I'm gonna start draining water from this one into here. Going back to the temperature of the water, I heated it up to 160 degrees. The reason for that is heat loss as I go into this. You're gonna lose a couple of degrees. I did put probably about a half a gallon of water in here that was hot just to get this cooler warmed up initially. I've also done the same on my mash tun just to get the cooler warmed up, let it set for a few minutes, increase the inside temperature. So now we'll take the grains, we're gonna start putting them into the mash tun as we drain small amounts of liquid. Remember, you're gonna wanna stir this the whole time. You don't want to get the dough balls like I was talking about. So we're gonna go ahead, we got a little bit of water in the bottom. I've got my grains here, I have 2 separate bags. They're the same deal, the bags just weren't big enough for these two to work together, or all fit into one bag. So I got my paddle spoon here. I'm gonna dump, and as I dump these grains, we're gonna continue to stir to keep those grains from clumping. That false bottom in here is gonna keep those grains from coming through as I drain this off, which will be called wort after this sits here for about an hour. Wort is basically the syrup and the extract that you get from the grains with all your starches and everything before you've added yeast. Once you add your yeast, they consider it beer. So as we add this, I'm going to continue to add water. This is a lot easier if you have 2 people, one to pour the grain, one to stir. So if I don't talk much during this, that's why, because I'm trying to keep from losing my grains. But we'll get all these in there. We'll let this set for an hour and just steep these grains at 157 degrees. And after that sets for an hour, we're going to drain this off and we'll have our wort that's ready to boil down. So let me get these grains in here. Like I said, this is a slow process. I don't want any dough balls in here, so I'm breaking it up as I go. A lot of grains that you buy, you may have to add rice hulls or oats, a thicker grain, to keep from getting a stuck sparge. What a stuck sparge is where your false bottom has plugged up and it's not letting any of the liquids through that metal screen. If you have that, it's a nightmare. I've had it once. Had to wait for my wort to cool off, which is terrible. You want a constant temperature on all this stuff. You don't want your temperatures dropping, fluctuating. Then you start breaking down the whole process as far as sparging, the breakdowns of your starches. You lose efficiency, and I think that beer ended up being only like 3.5% ABV. So just because of the process, I went to sparge it. And like I said, had to wait for it to cool down good enough where I could stick my hand in there and move the grains around to drain that wort out. So we're almost done adding the grains. If you get interested in this, this is my hobby. It's something I do for fun. So just remember, there is a pretty good upfront cost in doing this. But consider if you've ever went and bought craft beer, what they charge for that. You're looking at about anywhere from 5 to 10, 12 bucks for a beer. So you can do this, and if you bottle it, by the time you're done, you're looking at approximately $1 a beer for a craft beer that you brewed yourself. I was pretty intimidated with the whole process when I started. Really didn't think I could do this. It's not as hard as you think. So if you enjoy drinking craft beer, and you want to save some money, give this a try. There's a lot of starter kits you can buy. go to websites like Northern Brewer and you can order any equipment you need. It's pretty simple. Get online, you can create an account, you can get brew kettles, you can get these mash tuns. I bought this and built these myself because they're cheaper, they're insulated, and they were easy to make. Get on YouTube, follow some people if you get interested in this. Like I said, I'm doing a quick tutorial. There are people out there that this is all they specialize in on their YouTube channels, is brewing beer and telling you how to get it done right. So, all right, we've got our grains mixed in. Our temperature should be set right. You want like a runny oat milk consistency when you add your grains and your hot water. So that's what I'm working on right now, trying to get that consistency to where I have plenty of water. As those grains soak up some of this water, I don't want them to dry out. I want all my grains to be covered all the way through to the end of an hour soaking. So right now we're just going to mash this in. We've almost got it done. All right. Rinse this spoon off, this paddle. All right. We're done there. We are ready to put the lid on here and we're going to let it set for an hour. This is where I usually go back. I get some more water in here. I heat this up to about 170 degrees. That's going to be my sparge temperature for my water that I'm going to rinse the starches out of that grain with after this is done setting. So what I'll do, I'll drain all this liquid out of this mash tun right now into my brew kettle. Once I've done that, I'll take the water that I put back in here and I'm going to rinse that. I'm going to fill it back up, let it set. I'm going to drain that off. I'm going to do that twice with 170 degree water. So like I said earlier, temperature is key, so don't forget that. Okay, so while we're waiting, we've got our grains steeping. They're going to steep for about an hour. Warming up some more water to sparge with. In the meantime, I want to go over, if you want to do this, I highly recommend this book. This has all your grain flavors, your profiles, flavor profiles, along with yeast and hops. Also, if you're trying to figure out a recipe to make, look up on the Beersmith app. People post recipes on there all the time. Type in what kind of beer you're looking for. It'll pull up tons of recipes. So I wanted to bring that up before we got going again on this. Until then, I'm going to stop this video, let this stuff set. I still have 50 minutes of sitting here waiting on this. Like I said, it's not a quick process, but we're going to get through it, I promise. Bear with me. All right, welcome back. We've reached our hour-long wait of steeping the grains. We've heated up some more water for our sparge water to 170 degrees in here. We're now ready to pull the wort off the grain. What we're going to do is we're going to do a double batch sparge. So that means we're going to drain all the wort off of the grains from the initial steeping into my brew kettle that's down here. Once we do that, we're going to add more water to these grains. We're going to let it set. We're going to let it drain. We're going to do that again. We're going to do that twice. Should end up with around a 7-gallon batch of wort. We're going to boil that off to a little over 5 gallons, right around 5.5. You will have sediment in the bottom of it, so you have to account for that loss. 5 gallons will make close to 50 beers. That's a lot of beer. So just a reminder, every gallon you have, one thing I did want to go over, it's called vorloffing. You want to vorloff your grains. You'll have grains that have settled down underneath your false bottom in your mash tun. You're going to want to pull those off. By doing that, you're going to slowly drain the wort into a tea pitcher. And as you do that, you're going to take and you're going to circulate that back over the top of your grains. You're going to pour that back in slow. You're going to do this until you don't notice any grain sediment or very, very little grain sediment in your wort. So I know you can't see it right now. I'm just holding the tea pitcher underneath this silicone hose right here. I'm letting this run off real slow. Almost forgot this step. Started to drain it and noticed a bunch of grain sediment. So luckily I had my pitcher here. Right now I'm vorloffing that. So sometimes this will take three, 4 tries at getting this to where your grain and your wort have separated and it's nice and clear. So I take about half of this plastic tea pitcher here, fill it full of wort, and I just pour it slowly back on top of my grains. We're going to set that grain bed to where we don't have those grains running underneath that false bottom. We're going to pull all that sediment out, pour it back on top. That's the stuff that was fine ground, that is too small to be screened off by that false bottom. May only take you one time, may take you twice, may take you 3 or 4 times, just depending on what you're brewing and how the grinder was set. So, quick little deal on the grains if you're doing if you're going to do a grain bill. The way this happens, the way it produces starch, they let these grains germinate, and then they dry them, and they throw them in a kiln, which is basically an oven that roasts these grains to a certain color. Every time they roast them and they get a little darker, that puts more of a chocolate or a coffee or a biscuity flavor to add to your beer. So when you're making a grain bill and you're going to try and make your own recipe, I highly suggest trying it, but do your research first. If you don't know what you're going to end up with. You're gonna have to figure out how to blend your flavor profiles. That's the hardest part. Once you figure that out, some people are really good at it. You can do small test batches. Those test batches, maybe a 1 gallon batch. Just try it, experiment with it. That's the fun of craft beer. Come up with something you think you're gonna like and practice it. Give it a shot. What's the worst that happens on a small batch? You brew a gallon of beer, you have to pour it out because you don't like it. You know that you need to change something. Once you've done this and you've studied and figured out what you want, what flavors you want, that's where you go with, okay, now I need to change this, I need more of this grain, I want more of this flavor. So take your time, study that. Like I said, that John Palmer book has a lot of information in it, a lot of the flavor profiles. So go through that, set up your own profile. So right now I'm just draining these grains, the wort off of these grains. So give it time, we'll see what happens. So right now I'm just draining that wort off. You can see, if you've never done this or been around it, the smell is amazing. It smells like a sweet oatmeal smell. Like I said, this is a Shinerbach mock brew that I'm trying. I did get this recipe off of the app that I mentioned earlier, Beersmith. So once this is done and I've got this drained off, I've done 2 sparges. I'm going to show you how to sparge here in just a minute. This will take a few minutes for this to drain, and we'll come back and I'll record the sparging so you can see that and what we're doing right now. That's what my grains look like. That germination process, they take them, they grind them, and you add your water and it pulls those starches out of that grain, and this is what you end up with. If you tried that right now without your hops and your yeast, it's going to be a sweet, syrupy flavor. So remember that. All right, we'll be right back after I finish draining this and we start the sparge. Oh, one other thing. Notice I'm not draining this fast. It's a slow drain, and there's a reason for that. You pull it too fast, you're going to end up with a stuck sparge, and you don't want that. I mentioned that earlier in the video. It's a nightmare. So take your time. This is not a fast process. Enjoy doing this. I usually have music playing in the background, and remember, always have you a drink. If you're going to brew, you might as well have you a drink. I started with my Irish coffee this morning. I had me a little Jameson there. So take your time and enjoy it. This is a fun process. Okay, so we've drained about 2 gallons of wort off of this. And now what we're going to do is the batch sparge that I was telling you about. This was my cooler with the 170-degree water in it. Safety tip, I have this all working by gravity. That is hot water. Remember that. If you have problems lifting very high, they make pumps for this. I don't want anybody getting burned because I didn't have pumps on here and you thought this was the way to do it. So now when I go to sparge, I'm batch sparging. So I've closed my valve to here. No more liquid's gonna pour out until I fill this back up. When I do this, I'm gonna open this up slow, and I'm just gonna rinse these grains. I'm gonna take, I'm gonna fill this mash tun back up, and I just take and I just rinse those grains off until I fill this back up, and I'm gonna let it set for about 60 seconds after I do this, just to pull the rest of those starches and sugars off. That way we can get all those sugars. The way you're gonna make your alcohol is through the starches out of these grains. So as we fill this back up, I'm gonna want at least another 2-gallon batch of wort off of this. So I showed you what it looked like earlier. We're gonna go back up to about that same level in here. I don't wanna let this set very long. Just how I do it. Just trying to get the rest of those sugars rinsed off, those starches, and pull some more liquid, because we're gonna boil this, and when we boil it, that's an hour-long boil. So, like I said, this isn't a quick process. This is a drawn-out process. Sorry, I probably moved my camera off of that. I'm holding it by hand. So, one thing to remember, take your time with this. This isn't a quick process. Just enjoy the process, and you may try this once and decide you completely would hate it and would rather just go buy your own craft beer. But like I said, you're gonna spend a lot more in buying your own than if you brew your own. So we've almost got that filled up where I want it. I'm gonna let this just kind of soak into those grains. Add a little bit more. Like I said, we want about 6 to 6.5 gallons, because as we boil this, we're gonna boil a lot of that wort off. You're gonna average about 1.5 gallons burn off of evaporation during your boil, when you boil for an hour. So we're gonna let that set for a minute. Okay, we finished our second batch sparge. Now we have about 6.5 to 7 gallons of wort in here. Our next step is to bring this to a boil. Once we bring that to a boil, I'm going to show you what I have here. I have 1 ounce of German Northern Brewer hop pellets. Right there. And we're going to add 1/2 ounce of that as soon as it starts to boil. We're going to have a 60-minute boil time with 1/2 ounce pellets, 1/2 ounce worth of pellets. That's going to get us our bitter flavors in the beer. Without the bitter, it's nothing but sweet. The last 15 minutes, we're going to add the other half of that. That's going to give you your aroma. When I go to add that other 1/2 ounce, 10 minutes before, I'm going to add a Whirlflock tablet. That's all those are, just a Whirlflock tablet. What that does is coagulate the proteins in this, and it helps them settle to the bottom fast. Once we cool off to about, let's see, around 65 degrees to 70 degrees, then we're going to pitch our yeast. But I'm going to show you how to cool your beer off quick. The quicker you can cool your wort off, the faster your proteins will coagulate, settle to the bottom, and you're going to have a cleaner, clearer, more crisp looking beer. Okay, welcome back. We've reached our rolling boil, and at this point we're going to add our 1/2 ounce of hops to this. One thing I wanted to mention is never leave your wort unattended when you're doing this boil. All that foam on top is proteins. If you leave this unattended, you will have a boil over, and it will make a very nasty, sticky mess. So always stay close to your brew kettle as you begin this boil process. So we've added 1/2 ounce of hops, and we're going to let that boil for an hour now. So while this boils, we're going to sit here, we're going to listen to some more music and enjoy a drink. You don't have the foam on top anymore. That's called your protein break. At that point, your proteins have broke down enough to where they've started to settle, and they broke down to where you're not going to have that layer of foam on top. So that's an important point to watch in this boil process. At that point, you don't have as great a chance of boiling over but you still need to stand by your kettle and watch it the entire time. Okay, so we're 10 minutes before the end of the boil. What I've done, I've added the Whirlflock tablets, and I've also put a wort chiller in here. The wort chiller I mentioned earlier is to chill the wort down as fast as we can to coagulate those proteins so that they settle at the bottom. After this 10 minutes, we'll be done. This wort chiller has a water hose connection on it. I'll take that out. I'll set this on the ground, chill it as fast as I can, and at that point, then we're going to siphon it off into a primary fermenter. So 10 minutes from now, I'll be back with you. Okay, so we've finished chilling our wort, and we're ready to siphon the wort out of our brew kettle into a primary fermenter. I have my primary fermenter sitting right there on the floor. That has an airlock in the top of it with sanitized water in it. And the key here, especially from this point on, is to ensure that everything is fully sanitized. If it's not sanitized, then you could end up with a bacteria in your wort or your beer that completely ruins your beer. So you spent 4 to 5 hours brewing beer, and when you get ready to try it, it's going to taste terrible. So you always have to make sure you clean. If you're going to brew beer, you have to sanitize. There's more time spent cleaning than there is spent making beer. So I have an auto siphon on here. It's just a little pump handle that goes in a tube, siphons the beer down into my primary fermenter, and from that point, once it chills down to 70, I think I'm around 90 degrees right now. Once we chill down to 70, we'll pitch the yeast on top of it, and our yeast is a Kolsch style L yeast. When we get to that temperature, all we're going to do, open this package after we sanitize the package even, to get any bacteria that's on the outside of this package off. We'll sprinkle this on top of the wort, and we're ready to start brewing. We'll put it in this primary for about 5 to 7 days. After that, we'll move it into a glass carboy. We'll let it sit there for about 2 weeks. That helps it clarify, get nice and clear. We'll bottle it, and we'll put priming sugar in our bottling bucket, and we'll let it set for another 2 weeks and carbonate. After those 2 weeks, your beer is ready. So if you have any questions or comments about how to brew beer, leave a comment in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our videos, and hit that bell for notifications as to when we post a new video. Thanks, and y'all have a great day, and hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it was informative, and we'll see you next time.